Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hello everyone, thank you very much for being here. You are watching İLEM TV, and I am Leonard Faytre, independent consultant and PhD student at İBn Haldun University in Turkey, in Istanbul. And let me introduce you quickly İLEM TV. İLEM TV is the YouTube channel of the organization İLEM, that is based in Istanbul, Turkey. And İLEM aims at promoting Islamic sciences on very different dimensions of the Islamic culture. So they gather scholars, students, intellectuals, academics, and try to talk very important topics related to Muslim culture. So we have the great honor today to welcome and to receive Dr. Professor Umar Ryad. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How are you doing?
Fine, thank you so much for having me.
It's a great pleasure. So maybe just before jumping in, let me introduce you for those who don't know you yet. So Umar Ryad is professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Louvain University in Belgium. He's also a member of the Young Academy of Belgium and director of the Louvain Center for the Study of Islam, Culture and Society. And actually, I may say that you are a person who dedicated his whole life to knowledge, since his studies in Al-Azhar University in Cairo in the 90s, to his PhD dissertation about Mohammed Rashid Rida in Leiden University in the Netherlands. Umar Ryad was also assistant professor in Leiden University, in Utrecht University, and he taught also in Bern University, in Oslo University, was research fellow in many universities and institutes in Germany, and he is, of course, author of numerous of articles, chapters, and books. And I may say that your contributions, Ustaz, is mainly focused on the multiplex relations between Muslims, Europe, and modernity. So I have, for example, in mind two of your books, the Muslim reception of European Orientalism, for example, that you co-edited with Susanna Echel, and the Muslims in interwar Europe, right? So maybe as an introduction, I may ask you this first question. What motivated you to focus on those interactions between Islam, Europe, and modernity? What was the motive? What pushed you?
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with you today, really, and it's an honor to speak to you and to the public and also the lovers of the ILEM institution and TV. I think my answer to this question could focus on a personal story and academic story. If I start with the personal one, it is because of my Azhar background. As you have just mentioned, I studied at Al-Azhar, but I had the privilege to study at the Faculty of Languages and Translation, Islamic Studies in English. And here, as a secondary school boy interested in other cultures, languages, you come into the University of Al-Azhar Faculty of Languages, and then you start to study Islam in English. So the whole program was conducted as such that the student is studying Islamic studies in English and also having studying English literature and the culture and translation and all these things. I think this is the first encounter to understand Islam in other contexts. And I remember as a BA student, I was much interested in this idea of Orientalism. How do the other look at us? And with this limited resources at Al-Azhar at this time, I remember that I have discovered the Encyclopedia of Islam, which was a Leiden project, as you know, and I start reading it and thinking about it, how those Europeans write about Islam. And then the second encounter was in Leiden, when I started to study Islamic studies now, but from other perspectives. I remember that my late professor who died last year, the Dutch professor, just the first thing he told me, you are here in order to disagree with me. I mean, and this was a trigger to think about, many talks. This is the personal story. I mean, having this double background from Al-Azhar and then coming into Leiden, having my master's and PhD, this was a start. And then started to discover the world of Muhammad Rashid Rida. You have mentioned Al-Manar, and we know that Al-Manar was a window at the Muslim world, not only in the majority context, but also in the minority context outside the Muslim world and in Europe. And there, I started to think about encounters between Muslims and the West, Islam and the West, colonialism, reformism, modernism. What does modernity mean? What are the challenges that are facing Muslims from the colonial time on? And I think this is the academic story has started there, writing a master's thesis and a PhD on Rashid Rida, and then having an ERC, European Research Council, project focusing on Muslims in interwar Europe, the volume you have mentioned. And this is you know, the story of my early career. I would just admit this ERC project.
I think very interesting, Ustaz, the fact that in this project you mentioned right now, Muslims in interwar Europe, you not just focus on Muslims who are perceived as non-European, I mean, like coming from the Muslim majority societies, but you focus also on profiles that are really European, let's say, from those. I don't know, I'm not using the proper words here, but and very early, actually, we don't have this in mind. When you think about Muslims in Europe, we think about working immigrants, Gastarbeiter, for example, in Germany and so on. But here you are talking in this project about Muslims who are culturally European. So maybe can you tell us more about those profiles who are, I'm sure, multiplex and very various?
That's true. That's true. And I think if we look at this story of the colonial period, I mean, just from 19th century on till the interwar period, you are talking about, I mean, just we are talking about Western Europe here, because Eastern Europe has totally different story and development with the Ottoman Empire, as you know. But here the focus is on Western Europe, these, you know, civilized countries mostly colonizing the Middle East. And here we have to understand the context where those Muslims, how did they end up in Europe? It has to do with this colonial history. And not only the colonial history, these migrants who came from a Muslim context, but also European converts to Islam, those who adopted Islam for a reason or another. Here we should emphasize something, that those converts to Islam were attracted to Islam because of what they express also in their writings about their struggle with their Westernness, Europeanness, and a new Islamic identity, that they are talking about, that they have been attracted to Islam because of this spiritual you know, lack in European civilization. They were looking at other alternatives, especially after the First World War, which has devastated Europe, has killed more than 15 million people on the European continent and beyond. And those Europeans who converted to Islam, they were looking for spiritual alternatives. They were seeing these Sufi mystical aspects of Islam, and they're trying to adopt it in order to reconfigure their own life. Some of them have been to Mecca. I mean, just they traveled on Hajj and left really fascinating details about their experience there on the Mount of Arafah or besides the Kaaba. To mention just one example, this Dutch convert to Islam, Van der Hoog. And Van der Hoog, if you ask an average Dutch lady, she would know him because of the cosmetic brand now in the grocery shops after his name. This Van der Hoog traveled to Mecca in 1934, and he wrote really fascinating, travelogue or memoirs about his Hajj experience, in which he dwells upon this, that he, as a European, with this advancement, with this just luxury life, leaving it behind, being on the mountain of Arafah, only on the mountain of Arafah, experiencing this moment, although he was very sick. But this is actually why most of those converts adopted Islam, either in Europe or in the colonial cities.
This is the question that if I came to my mind immediately, like, what is the path? What is the stories behind those converts? Like, how do they know about Islam? Like in universities, I don't know, in Europe, or through books, or through maybe travels, as you said, in colonial territories. Could you tell us a
Yeah,
bit more?
there are several aspects here. First of all, it started with these travels to the east, and by the way, it's not only a modern colonial idea. It was also in the early modern times. You find some of these examples, and by the way, because of this encounter and this question of conversion, is very interesting to study, because it's just like, you know, how did they change their life? But here the trajectory started, for example, in the colonial I mean, just regions or space where they traveled, sometimes also as military, sometimes as civil servants, and they started to know Islam. Others would just story start in a book, reading about Islam, seeing just like, you know, struggling with some theological problems in their own religion or culture, and then finding these solutions in Islam, looking for the spiritual paths. Others also, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, who were habitual visitors to the mosques. I mean, just like, you know, if we are talking about mosques in that time, we mentioned the Walking Mosque in London, we mentioned the Paris Mosque in France, we mentioned the the mosque in Berlin. But here I should emphasize that you find the Lahore Ahmadiyya movement were very active in Europe at this time, and some of those converts, they knew Islam through not I mean, just the Qadianis and the Lahoris were active, but the Lahoris were more or less successful in getting not only converts but also Sunni Muslims. I mean, just Sunni Muslims in that period were mostly inclined to visit a Lahori mosque than a Qadiani one. So this is something we have to understand, also their role in that. So here you have just several reasons why did the why were they attracted to Islam in principle.
Okay, and because we are talking now about the interwar times, so between the First and the Second World War. So what was actually their role in this period? Because also we know also the context, the general context, the economic crisis after the 1929 economic crisis, and the rise of fascism, communism, also groups was fighting one another in the streets and so on. So what were the roles of those Muslims in this very tense period?
This is a very interesting question, because actually it started with the First World War. By the way, the First World War, as we know, it was called in its time the Great War.
Yeah.
We called it the First World War when the Second World War has come. And why is that? Because people had the impression this devastating war is great, and no greater war will come to the modern history of humanities. And it was just a myth, because we were old, and just people were just thinking, while when the Great War ended, people were worried about a Second World War. Like we now, with what is happening in Ukraine, what happened in Syria, we are all in this nightmare of a Third World War. And this is what had happened. When the Second World War was triggered, we looked back, 2 or 3 decennias before, and we looked at the First World War and we called it like that. Here we have to emphasize the role of the Ottoman Empire in that war. This German-Ottoman alliance, which we know, the question of the German jihad motivated by, German-Ottoman jihad motivated by the Mufti, the Sheikh al-Islam at this time. We know all that story, but we have to emphasize that here we are talking about tens of Muslims who participated in this war on both fronts. And I would just say it, just maybe it's pity to say it, but Muslims have taken part in this war which was not theirs. Yeah. It was a European war where Muslims were dragged from all parties in order to take part of it. Look at the Ottoman side, look at the Indian, the North African, French side, the African in Senegal and the others. So this actually was a wholesale war which dragged many Muslims. And this was the trigger of those Muslims to stay in Europe after the First World War.
Can I ask a question here?
Sure,
because
sure.
We started a discussion with this distinction between Muslims coming from colonial territories and Muslims coming from West Europe, who were converts. So here, maybe we can go on with this distinction, because in this war, in this Great War you are talking about, there were maybe forced Muslims who were forced to fight from Senegal, from Morocco, Algeria. So I'm French, so those countries come to my mind when we talk about the First World War. But what about those converts who were actually European, converted to Islam, or maybe not yet, but I don't know. So maybe their stories are maybe different. So maybe you can talk about both categories, or maybe you cannot make such a distinction. I don't know.
Yeah, the recruits in the war, we have to say something. I mean, just Algeria, they were forced. Morocco and Tunisia, not in many cases, because they were paid soldiers. I mean, but in Algerian case or in Senegal, it was just must that they had to be recruited to them. But away from that, away from the moment of the war, what I would like to make as a clear point, all the Ottomans or Algerians or Moroccan or Tunisian or Senegalese, Muslims or non-Muslims South Africa who stayed in Europe after the First World War were remnants of this war. This is what I want to make. That after the war was over, what you have, I mean, just like, look at France. They have built this great grand mosque in Paris just as a thankful, token and to Muslims who fought in the First World War. What I would like to make, these tens of thousands of Muslims who remained after the war were actually consequences of this war. We shouldn't forget also in 1919 with the Paris Conference. I mean, just like, some of those intellectuals and politicians just remained in Europe also and made Europe their own destination. Some of them also were exiled. I mean, look at Prince Shakib Arsalan or many other Ottomans like Talat Pasha and Anwar Pasha and all the exiled in Ottomans in Berlin. So here we are talking about two different histories: the intellectual history on the one part, those intellectual Muslim and activists who wrote about their experiences, who established themselves and organizations and journals and published books in Europe. And you have the subaltern history of the normal people whose history actually has been buried. I mean, these normal people, we don't know much about them. Those let me put it, poor, Moroccans or Algerians, maybe their descendants are still there, but their stories, they had their own stories, which we don't know much about it, unfortunately, except that when you go into archive and they have become just names and numbers and addresses, but their story is sometimes unknown to us.
Okay, so your project about Muslims in inter-war Europe is more focused on these intellectual or diplomats, politicians,
more or less,
for whom we can have, I don't know, maybe letters, photos, even things like this, archives.
And just a story which I mention everywhere, and I hope that for those listeners today who have listened to me once about this story of the project, the project has started in a telephone directory. So I'm so sorry to repeat it to those who have listened to this story once, but it has started really in a telephone directory. I mean, just you have a name, this Ottoman name, you don't know anything about it, and then except the family name Kiram, and then you go to das Telefonbuch and you find two people living in whole Germany with this family name, you phone, and then you have, the whole story. Yeah, and then a whole archive, really a whole archive of the gentleman who has become, who was an Arab officer in the Ottoman army in the First World War. And then he ended up in Berlin, married to a German lady, opened a bookshop, started his life, being also part of a big network of Muslims in interwar Europe at this time. And this has just started as a tiny story in a telephone directory.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So and descendants still live in Germany also. They didn't move.
No, because actually it's if you, I can talk about this story for a long period, but just one thing, he was an Ottoman officer, Arab officer in the Ottoman army. He studied in Istanbul as an Arab in the military academy. He's mentioning also in one of the things that Ataturk was older than he was a few years, but he knew him. He knew Talat Pasha and Enver Pasha personally. So from this generation, but from the Arab officers, injured in the war because he was the commander of the Bedouin troops in Al Arish, and then he ended up in Berlin, and there he did not get the Syrian nationality, but remained Turkish.
Okay.
So after the Turkish Republic, he became Turkish till the end of his life. His German wife had to get the German quit the German nationality, and she was Turkish. His son Harun Rashid remained Turkish till the 50s. He could not get the German nationality. So you have now an Arab-Turkish story in that. And I think, just like, I don't want to get into much details about this figure, but what I want to say and to emphasize, I have told you that some of these personal stories have been almost buried in history, but they are still there. So you can get these stories again. You can reconstruct them again if you have the luck and to find their archives.
And I find this very interesting because nowadays, the mediatic and political debate nowadays about Muslims, we talk a lot about immigrants, migrations. So I would not even go to the far right propaganda and polemics, but somehow what you are saying is like, actually, Muslims are European for much more longer than what we suppose or what we assume. And so maybe we can keep talking a bit with this particular story because this illustrates also the whole topic. So what happened, for example, to his publishing house? He said he established a publishing house. So because then, the National Socialist regime came into power. So so what happened in this very time where it was not good to be foreigner in Germany, right? So what happened to him? What happened to his publishing house? Do we still have this building until today, reminding of?
We have only pictures, and unfortunately, I cannot show you this here. But we have pictures of this publishing house, which was his wife's property originally, but he called it Maktabat al-Sharq wal-Gharb, the bookshop of Orient and Occident. What happened, we have to get a bit back to the situation of Arabs and Muslims in Nazi Germany. Because the Nazis, because of their, let me put it this way, their interests in the East, the Jewish-Palestinian conflict, they were bidding on that. So therefore, they have treated the Arabs carefully compared to the Jews. Although the Arabs were Semitic, but they were very careful in treating with them because of their opportunistic, pragmatic relationship with the Middle East. To make it clear, and some of those Arabs ended up in Nazi circles. They were working, for example, you have Radio Berlin in Arabic. And there, some of those Arabs and Turks, they worked there in these radio programs against the French and the British. So the enemy of the enemy is a friend. So even the Nazis, for example, if you think about Mein Kampf, a proposal was made in that period whether we should translate it into Arabic. But Mein Kampf contains some nasty things about the Arabs. Should we remove them or not? But Hitler did not agree that they should be removed, should remain there. So we have in the Nazi period just extracts, translated extracts of Mein Kampf. So the situation of the Arabs were very, very difficult. For example, when the Nazis would decide to collaborate with somebody from the East, they would say, okay, but he is not 100% Semite, he is Caucasian. So he belongs to other ethnic race. So here you have but somebody like Kiram, he worked in Radio Berlin. He was involved in some activities. Some people said that he was a double agent working to the British through the Turkish consulate in Austria while he's working for the Germans. So it's a bit, I make a joke sometimes when you read these stories, it is just James Bond in that time. I mean, just this espionage and these things you read about these stories which you see only in films. But this was the fate of those Muslims. When you look at the European scale, those Muslim intellectuals, they wanted also to have a space in Europe. They wanted to establish schools, more mosques. To mention just one example, the first European Muslim Congress was initiated in Geneva in 1935 under the auspices and the leadership of Prince Shakib Arsalan. And Prince Shakib Arsalan, a Druze Lebanese prince who was exiled in Europe for more than 24 years, he wanted to get the example of those Muslims in Eastern Europe. Muslims in Eastern Europe are European Muslims, and we have to learn from their experiences. So he wanted to establish schools, mosques. But what has happened 3-4 years later, the Second World War was erupted, and all the dreams and hopes of those Muslims just like, vanished with the war.
Yeah.
To be continued after the Second World War to another story, which is the guest workers, what you have mentioned. So you have an intellectual history, a subaltern history of those Muslims as part and parcel of European interwar history. But after the Second World War, you have a totally different history, which is here related to the reconstruction of Europe, the guest workers who came in the 50s and 60s and later and established themselves in Europe, and they have become citizens. I mean, just those intellectuals in the interwar period, they did not have European nationalities. But after the guest workers story, they have become citizens.
Yeah, interesting. So how can we maybe interpret the relations between those two stories, the two categories of Muslims coming to Europe or having a relation with Europe? So you have these intellectual stories and maybe more, I would not say working class, or maybe more popular stories, right?
Yeah.
So how can we connect both? And so maybe as someone who analyzes these stories, but also, is there any connections concretely for schools, for mosques, I don't know, for mosques, maybe?
I think my answer would be divided into things. If we are look at the bigger umbrella questions, which I would call umbrella question, that these challenges, Islam and the West, modernity, a question of how do we perceive this Europe? I think these big questions, they are recurring in the post Second World War story in a way or another, in other forms. When it comes to citizenship, integration, assimilation, education, all these things. But in the interwar period, the questions were there, the bigger questions. Maybe the details, they're different. But if you look at the literature which those Muslims produced in the interwar period, you find the same struggles, the same imagined questions when it comes to Western critique of Islam, European critique of Islam. The West is always looking at Islam in general. I mean, just like here, West is a big word, but I mean the critique coming from the West of the Islam. Islam is anti-woman. Islam is a militant religion. Islam is this and this. All this remnant of medieval thinking about Islam is still there in the discourse, and it was also in the discourse in the colonial period. And those Muslims in interwar Europe, they were reacting on that. They were looking at Europe on the one hand as the ugly colonizer, but again, it's their civilization, the mixed marriage, their integration process. After the Second World War, the same big questions, they remain on that intellectual level, but it has now differed in practice. I would just mention, maybe, if you allow me, 3 stages, maybe 4, I don't know, by which Muslims have developed their position in Western Europe after the Second World War. You look at the first stage, these were the guest workers without families. Just like, men mostly coming to work, living together, do not have this communal problem, praying in prayer halls. Mosques were very minimum. They were not really widespread as we see nowadays. So the religious needs were also minimum. It's only fasting, praying, maybe thinking about halal meat, halal slaughtered meat. So it was just like, within these individual mostly male communities. So the religious needs were not that much. Europe also has looked at them, here, politics, administration. We're looking at them as temporary workers. They are here for a few years and they will leave. So they did not consider the idea of a kind of institutionalization of Islam. Europe did not think about it. But once they had the right to get European nationalities, this has changed, because now they have become citizens. The family reunion, their families came in the 70s, 80s. And when you have a family, family is the unit of the society. Family needs schools, family needs mosques, family needs organizations. So now Muslims have started to rethink their position, establish more mosques, having citizenship rights, away from all the racist discrimination discourse in Europe, whatever it is, but they were and they are still citizens with specific rights. Here you have just like a kind of friction between the existence of Muslims and Islam and European societies. And this friction, I explain it in the following. Europe has become individualized when it comes to religion. Religion is pushed to the private domain. Religion should not have a space on the street because of this secularization process, which has become after the 60s very, very strong in Europe, after the student movement and all these liberation movements in Europe. While the Europeans are pushing religion to the private domain, what has happened, Muslims, because Islam is a visible religion like Judaism, have come with their mosques, with their minarets, with their Arabic letters on the streets of Hamburg or Brussels or Amsterdam. Now, on the one hand, you have what you can call the de-churching of Europe. Europe does not recognize the church as a public institution in some countries, while Islam is being established. And here it is coupled with all the economic crisis. So Muslims were looked at the foreigners who come to our place in order to have our jobs, in order to have our place, in order to have their visible religions, which this foreign religion, what is doing there. And then this has in the 90s and up, and this is the third and fourth stage, which we will talk about till 11th of September, is coupling the internal local Islamic debates to the internationalization of what the so-called in European media Islam problem.
Yeah.
Look at Algeria, look at the radical movements everywhere. So you see here, you see that this has started. This friction has started because Islam is not only the local problem, is not only the local debate, but it is also connected to a bigger international debate about Islam as a religion and also terrorism between brackets.
So yeah, and it is interesting here. Like actually, you mentioned like the first step was those workers who came alone, so they didn't have this great need to build mosques, etc., etc. And at the same time, in this interwar period, you mentioned also that Muslims who had another background, another intellectual or social status, social position, they already started to establish something bigger than the only individual worshipping.
Yeah.
But maybe, as you said, at that time, the world problems were not problematized in the same way.
And all the number.
Sorry?
The number of Muslims was not that big as we see it in the post Second World War period.
Yeah. So yeah. So what happened, for example, like those organizations of mosques that have been established before the Second World War?
Yeah.
Even if it is a few. Did they remain after? Or
mostly
which role did they play in the integration of newcomers coming from workers and lower social status?
Yes, this is a very good question because we are talking about individual examples. Mostly, except the mosque in Paris, which was big, other mosques were just tiny. They are not really big spaces. To mention, for example, the Walking Mosque. The Walking Mosque in London, it was established as a building in the late 19th century by a Hungarian-German Orientalist who lived in India and got some donation to establish an Oriental house.
With the Oriental architecture.
Yeah, in an Oriental house, just like a meeting point. And after his death, what has happened, that the building was deserted. And Walking is at the outskirts of London. So it's 1 hour from London Central. So it was a bit exerted, a bit just remote from the city. But when the Lahore Ahmadiyya came to London, they regenerated the building and they re-owned it and they changed it in a mosque. This mosque is still there, but it's a tiny building. but it's now extended with an annexation of a place, a very big place where people now could pray for Friday. Walking mosque does not have any Ahmadiyya character anymore. It's now a Sunni mosque. So the Ahmadiyya is the story, and you feel that the people are just like, very critical to that point because of this sensitivity around the Ahmadiyya movement and all these things. I don't want to get into these theological debates now, but it's now a Sunni community. The mosque in Berlin is also small. They called it actually in the German media at this time the Taj Mahal of Berlin, because it had really the minaret like Taj Mahal, the big Taj Mahal, but it's a small, tiny. It's still Ahmadiyya, Lahore Ahmadiyya. But strangely, not strangely, interestingly enough, it's still visited by Sunni Muslims. And the preachers in the Ahmadiyya mosque, they know their followers, therefore they don't get into debates about their character. And the khutbah is just like, like any other mosque. But you see, if you visit this in Berlin, you see that every Friday, all communities from all backgrounds, they are attending the mosque. The Paris mosque is another story, because it's a North African project. And there you see still the North African character there. So they are still playing that role. Yeah. But they are not the only ones. I mean, just like, there are other small mosques also coming from that period. But they have become the other way around. I mean, here, they have become integrated in the bigger story after the Second World War. It's not that they have influenced the establishment of new mosques after the Second World War, but they have become only a historical site, which you could just like, point at it and they say, okay, look, it's not only these new mosques you see, the Turkish and Moroccan mosques you see in the European landscape. No, but there were remnants of something which was here before the war, and it's part of the story. I mean,
maybe also helping to build an identity, maybe European Muslim identity. I don't know, to say that we have all buildings coming from another background.
Yeah, I think this is what is forgotten in the public debate. That Islam, in that sense, I'm not talking about Spanish period, in the medieval period, and now I'm talking about the modern period. I think this is what is forgotten in the debate, that Islam has become part of European history. It is part of the land.
Yeah, definitely. And Ustaz, I would like also to ask you a question. I think you also raised in your different contribution and participations in debates, conferences, and so on. This question, so we are talking now about like Muslim established in Europe from different backgrounds. Well, a minority, I don't know, there's no official statistics, but it is around maybe 6-7% of the whole European population. So Western population, I may say. We don't talk about Bulgaria and so on. So yeah, so how do they live Islam? And I know you talk also about this concept of ILEM Aqariyat, to the Islamic jurisprudence of minorities. So something that I find very interesting. I don't know much more about it. So can you tell us more about this question of how Muslims live their Islam there, and how, and what is this fiqh al-Aqariyat?
Yes. I mean, let me get back to this question. I mean, this historical 3 stages, because in the beginning, what I have said, that the religious needs were really minimal. The questions were not that complex, because it's just like, okay, praying is praying, fasting is fasting, eating halal food is eating halal food. But once you come closer to this integration of Islam in Europe, you come across very, really crucial debates. Think about political participation. Think about Muslims having a party or not. Voting for a Christian party. This is one. Buying a house with mortgage, which is interest, which is riba, which is haram or not. A mixed marriage. Conversion to Islam. A woman, a European lady, decides to convert to Islam. Should she divorce from her husband or not? And many of these questions. Working in a restaurant while you are required to serve wine and pork. All these questions have become very complex, and depending on the traditional fiqh, will not give the answer. Because, I mean, just here I'm talking about the majority traditional understanding of fiqh. I'm not talking about the minority views. And therefore, some people, some European, some Muslim scholars, especially the late, rahimahullah, Sheikh Taha Jabir al-Alwani, I should mention his name because he is the pioneer in that. Sheikh Taha Jabir al-Alwani, an Iraqi scholar, studied at Al-Azhar. He was the chairman of the IIIT, the Islamic Institute for the International Institute for Islamic Thought in the States, in the United States. And as a faqih and usuli, he was thinking about, you know, those Muslims sending their questions either to Cairo, to Al-Azhar, or to Jeddah, or to Pakistan, or wherever. They get always traditional answers. And this makes the life of Muslims much more complex and difficult in a European context. Therefore, he thought about it. We should initiate a new fiqh, a new jurisprudence that would fit, on the one hand, the Islamic law. It's not a liberal progressive solution, but it emanates from the tradition. It emanates from the original sources, but it should help Muslims in their life. Just to mention one of these examples, if you allow me. He was asked once, and this is very, very interesting, regarding also the here drawing and portraying the Prophet Muhammad in cartoons and all these things. He was asked in the 90s by a group of Muslims that in the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., you have a frieze on the wall of the outside the building with 18 people who changed the human law, the human ruling, the human rule of law, starting from, you know, Moses till Napoleon, for example. And all those people are portrayed in this frieze, including the Prophet Muhammad. So there is an image of the Prophet Muhammad where he is carrying the Quran and a sword, you know, and then he was one of those changers of human law. So those, and the building is dating to the 30s, so it is from the early 1930s. So this group of Muslims came to Alwani, and they even suited a case against the Supreme Court that this part of the Prophet Muhammad should be removed. But to the surprise of many, Taha Jabir al-Alwani's answer was totally different. He looked at it from a different point of view. He started just like, you know, to think, okay, why does Islam forbid imaging in the early period? This is because Islam was closer to the heathen pagan history, and therefore Islam wanted to cut immediately this praying and worshipping images. So this one. So all the hadiths which are prohibiting images is just focusing on that. And then he started to say, okay, look, the image maker and the architect, their intention was good. It was not to defame the Prophet Muhammad. And within an American plural society, we have to appreciate their work. And this image could play a very important role. Suppose that a Muslim hater jump into the Supreme Court, which is a symbol of justice for Americans, and he looked and he find the picture of the Prophet Muhammad, while the Prophet Muhammad is portrayed in the American media as the militant, the military, and he's seeing him here as a symbol symbolizing the American plural justice. It would change mind. And then, much more interesting for that, he's looking at this, he's just saying, Western culture is the culture of image. Arab culture is the culture of word. So here, Europeans are much attracted to images, but we Arabs and Muslims are attracted to a beautiful calligraphy. But calligraphy does not speak to the European eye. So here he is, from a sociological point of view, trying to understand it. So here you have this Taha Jabir al-Alwani, he put the layer for this fiqh al-aqaliyat. The mastermind, I would say, behind fiqh al-aqaliyat, or the one who really issued fatwas, is, or just like was interested in the practical embodiment of this fiqh al-aqaliyat, was Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who is now based in Qatar. And he issued many fatwas, including that Muslims are allowed to have to buy a house with mortgage, and it's not really the interest that is meant in the old fiqh books, and also not meant in the Quran. You know, and being a woman, European woman who converts to Islam while her husband remains non-Muslim, is allowed to stay with her husband without any divorce, because Islam is always for family, for unity. And you see that those people within fiqh al-aqliyat, they are looking much more from the ethical point of view. Always they are considering answering the questions from an ethical point of view, the ethics of Islam, how Islam give priority to this or that, and then looking for minority views in Islamic law, which would support their views in order to facilitate the life of Muslims. Therefore, they call this fiqh al-aqliyat the fiqh of muwatana, the fiqh of citizenship. They call it fiqh al-taysir, the fiqh of making some facilitation. You know, so this is for them fiqh al-taysir, just how to make the lives of Muslims much easier in a European context when you depend on the minority context or views in Islamic law.
Thank you very much, Ustaz. Like these explanations are very, very, very important to us nowadays. We are fighting on different grounds. Just before I ask my next question, I would like to remind to everyone who is watching this video that you can write your questions in the comments, and I will try to ask them directly to Sheikh Umar Ryad. So please write your questions under the comments. It will be very appreciated. And you can also subscribe to this channel, ILEM channel, and to get updated to all the activities of this organization. So now, after you explain what is fiqh al-aqliyat, on what it is based, and what it is the utility of it, do Muslims in Europe follow it, use it, benefit from it? And what is your analysis from it?
This is very good question. This is very, very good question. I think I'm so sorry that I could not make you happy that all Muslims are familiar with it. So this would be really against any academic evaluation, because it's still the minority who are following it, because Muslims are still dependent on their own communities. I mean, be a Moroccan mosque or a Turkish mosque or an Egyptian mosque, people are following their imams, and the imam is, I think it is, and some of the imams even do not agree with fiqh al-aqliyat, by the way. Some of the traditional imams, they see that fiqh al-aqliyat is something that is not needed for Muslims, and Muslims should depend on the majority things. So the first gate to Muslims is the mosque and imams. Therefore, you find, I think to answer your question from a research point of view, we still need sociological research about that, to see how far Muslims are aware of that. And I have some students, for example, in Leiden a few years ago, one of the students made a sociological empirical research how Muslims know about, and if they even know about, this mortgage fatwa, or are they ready to follow it. And you see that Muslims are divided. Some people are really startled and really surprised. How come? Is there a view like that? Because, you know, so I think sociological and empirical research is needed in order to define this, but it's still very important phenomenon, because it and I think if we do research about this fiqh al-aqliyat, we have several methods. First of all, you have this discourse analysis method, so that you think, okay, if this fatwa about this mortgage or about this marriage, this woman who converted to Islam, where does it come from? Which mazhab? Which minority views? I think this is very needed in order to look into the fiqh. Where does it come from? Some political scientists are interested. I think you have invited Andrew Marsh, if I'm not mistaken, here in this program.
I'm not coming directly from ILEM. I have to check. But
no, but I mean, I think Andrew Marsh was one of the guests, and Andrew Marsh was one of the people who were just like, you know, elaborating on this idea of fiqh al-aqliyat from a political science citizenship point of view. And then you have this sociological empirical research. How does it filter and reach out to Muslims in a European society? But unfortunately, it's not clear whether all Muslims, these more than 40 million Muslims in Western Europe, know about it or not.
And I would say also, because as European Muslim, I met those questions in my life. We are still discussing those questions with friends, with families, and so on. And the thing I may say also, this debate is very not easy, because now we are talking in a very safe environment, in ILEM, TV, or maybe if we talk together in university in Louvain, also it is safe. We are talking about science, about knowledge, and with a purity of intention, let's say. So we want to know the truth, what is useful for the Muslims, and so on, and what is convenient for Muslims in Europe in this particular context of minorities, and so on and so on. But there's also this question are also asked in a political tense context, right? This rise of far right and extremist movement from the far right and nationalists in Europe, right? Is growing up, and there's also politicians from the far right who are using this concept of fiqh al-aqaliyat in order to oppress Muslims, right, in the daily life, and saying, you don't have to, just say an example, you don't have to wear a hijab, or you don't have to eat halal meat, you don't have to show yourself, as you said, in a secular society, you should not show off your religiosity, and so on. So go to the path of fiqh al-aqaliyat and hide yourself and try to be assimilated or integrated, and so on. So
yeah.
As a common Muslim, I must also say that maybe I would not use a proper term, but the hostility around fiqh al-aqaliyat is also coming from a political context that has nothing to do with fiqh, with usul, or with knowledge, actually. This is just the bad atmosphere that we are living in today in Europe. It's not, I don't know, I may say it's not convenient for a peaceful discussion about fiqh al-aqaliyat. So I don't know, how do you...
Yeah, look, it's I mean, regarding far right question in general, I mean, just like, they are not happy with the presence of Muslims anyhow, whether it is with moderate or traditional or radical. I mean, just Islam is just put on one scale, and it's danger for European Judeo-Christian civilization, and it doesn't belong to here. This is actually making votes. People who are just like looking for votes in politics, and this populist discourse is very needed when it comes. I mean, just look at the Netherlands, when you have this Geert-Wilders movement having quite a number of seats in the parliament. So it means that they are represented by a number of people in whatever minority it is, but they are represented by a number, or they represent a number of people in the society, also a big number. I mean, just a big percentage when you look at the difference. But anyhow, this is just like, building on that, having from time to time sensational problems in order to build on that and get votes. And their votes actually are won, or they gain votes in mostly regions where no Muslim is living. So they are bidding on this idea of fear, frightening. So if you look, for example, go to a remote village in the Netherlands where maybe 1 or 2 Muslims are living, and ask people, why do you hate Muslims? Yeah, they are dangerous. Have you ever seen a woman with niqab on the street? No, I didn't see, but they are anyhow this and that. So they are bidding on that. They are just having this fear and building on it, whether it is fiqh al-aqaliyat or not. It doesn't care.
Okay,
but maybe the people within fiqh al-aqaliyat, I mean, just Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, for example, because of his outspoken views about Palestine and martyrdom among Palestinians and Israelis, and this makes him much more, figured for these sensational problems from time to time. I mean, just he's now very old. I mean, just I hope him all the health and age. But here, those people behind fiqh al-aqaliyat are always those far rights. They are looking for old YouTube films or audio films where they just have some outspoken views about some delicate political issues, and they started to get it out of that. But if you allow me, I think I see 2 questions in the chat.
Yeah, please. So yeah, the first question is related also to fiqh al-aqaliyat. Is Ustaz, what do you think about maqasid al-sharia concept? Can it help us to regulate fiqh al-aqaliyat?
they are building on that. I mean, just as I said, you have Taha Jaber al-Alwani, who is a Maqasidi scholar. He is known as that, and he is much concerned in usul al-fiqh. So he's building on this maqasid when it comes to the principles and fundamentals of fiqh al-aqalliyat. And what I have said, if you read their fatwas carefully, they start with this ethical question, which is related to maqasid here. They are looking, for example, this question of this lady who converted to Islam and her husband not. They start with this, that Islam, the maqsad, the ultimate goal of Islam is to keep families united. So this idea of unity would just let us think that she could stay. And they start to look at the fiqh views. This idea of having a house with mortgage, they start like that. They say, here, Muslims are citizens. And if they remain in rented houses forever, their children will not have a solid place in these countries. So buying a house means that you are strong in the society. So here they start from this, and they started to have the fiqh rulings and discuss it from this end. So you see in their mechanism, they are having these maqasid in mind and also putting it in the fatwa.
Starting from the goals.
They start from the goals.
Then,
okay, and then look in minority views. For example, if you look at this fatwa of a woman staying with her non-Muslim husband, they have found some views for Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah had a view that the wife could stay with her non-Muslim husband, but he said without the intimate relationship. And Sheikh Qaradawi just made, I mean, this is impossible that husband and wife would just be together and having family and this and that. So you see that Ibn Taymiyyah had this view. Ali ibn Abi Talib also, something is related to him. So they are digging in the fiqh works in order to find such views which support this ultimate goal of maqasid from an Islamic point of view.
Thank you very much, Ustaz. The second question is maybe more related to the sociological conversation we had. How would you perceive religious authority in the Western context? How is different from Muslim majority countries?
I think there are many layers to answer this question. First of all, if you look at the mosques, I said imams are still playing that role, especially when it comes to the older generation. So they are still influential in the mosque units. But the youth is not really related to this authority of the mosque in a way or another. I mean, I'm not talking about the youth in general, but you see that there is a tendency among youth to look for authority in other places, especially on the internet. And here I'm not only talking about those radical views who are just picking and choosing some views on the internet, but looking at internet figures, muftis, who are really dominating the social media, people who have just like, some views. And you see that religious authority is now changing from the pulpit, from the member in the mosque to the air, to the internet, to the social media. And this is also what you see. You see there is a tendency among the youth to look for the role models on the internet, and it is very, very influential. And you see that they are repeating these ideas of those influential, I mean, just influencers, Muslim religious influencers, if you could just say, and there are many, many examples of that.
Yeah, definitely. And like something coming to my mind, like I'm going actually to a Turkish mosque, and I may say that my fellows congregational prayers, people who pray with me, most of them, they are not Turkish. They don't understand Turkish language. And
even for Arabic mosques, by the way, I mean, just third and fourth generation, they do not understand the khutbah. They cannot follow Arabic. And you see, I mean, just it's a pity to say, but you see the children and the youth, they're sitting in the background, just like, on their Facebook pages. And, but there is a tendency, by the way, there is a tendency nowadays in some Dutch mosques and other mosques that preaching is in Dutch. Now, people are turning to that because of the young generation. They do not have good command of Arabic.
Definitely.
At the moment.
Okay. So I don't see any other questions. So I don't know if you want to mention or to elaborate another point you think very crucial for this topic of Muslims in Europe. Ustaz?
No, I think the challenges are coming. I mean, more challenges. I mean, especially now we are talking about fourth and fifth generation, and I think we should be aware of that. That those fourth and fifth generation, I don't know whether you belong to them or not, but they will have much more problems when it comes to on the country of origin. They are tourists, and in European context, they are foreigners. Still, more or another. So I think the struggle would be, I mean, just the pressure will be bigger. Their questions will not, because they will be detached away from the traditional ideas within Islamic thought, and they need really new, really strong movement, which is just like talking to them, not only in their language but their thinking. I mean, whether we like or not, fourth and fifth generation Muslims will be Dutch and Belgian and French. I mean, they will be. I mean, they are.
Yeah, of course.
So you have to address them as such. And if the Muslim institutions really are not aware of that and really hurry to help them and to get out of these traditional answers to their problems, you may lose ground, and it would be very, very pity. And we know that atheism and things are really growing, not only among Muslim youth in Europe, but also Muslims in the majority context in Muslim countries. And I think it's not only related to the problem here. Maybe the pressure is bigger here, but I think you should have a wholesale, a wide scale reformation of many ideas that are rotating in the traditional context of Islam, and this is what I would just remark at the end.
Thank you very much, Ustaz. And I may say, like, a Euro project about Muslims in the interior Europe may help a lot in building such a European grounded Islam, or let's say, like, as an identity. I don't speak about knowledge and fiqh discussion, but as identity, as to feel as a European Muslim. I think it's also very important to be able to say, like, oh, who were my the people who were before me, who came here before, who established organization, most, etc. In this continent. Thank you very much. I don't
Thank you so much, brother.
so maybe we can complete our discussion here. Thank you very much, Chair Umar Ryad. It was a great honor for me to moderate this talk. Very fruitful, very useful for all of us. And
it was also a pleasure, and thank you so much for your efforts and for the whole team of ILEM. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and have a great Ramadan. It's coming soon.
Yeah, you too. Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan Mubarak.
Ma salam.
Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.